My name is Alli Parker and I'm an author. My novel is called At the Foot of the Cherry Tree and it's published by HarperCollins Australia. At the Foot of the Cherry Tree is a novelisation of the true story of Australia's first Japanese war bride, who is a woman named Cherry Parker and is also my grandmother. So my grandfather, Gordon Parker, signed up for the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces post-World War II to serve in occupied Japan and resettle it post-war. And on his very first day there, he met Nobuko Sakuramoto, otherwise known as Cherry. And despite incredibly strict anti-fraternization policies between the Australians and the Japanese, the two of them became friends and fell in love. And as Gordon's service came to an end, he decided he wanted to bring Cherry back to Australia with him as his war bride, and then discovered the White Australia policy wouldn't let her into the country because she was from a non-white, non-European background. So Gordon returned to Australia and spent the next 4.5 years campaigning the government to change the policy to allow Cherry and their first two children, who were both born in Japan, into Australia to bring them home. The reason that I wanted to write this story about Cherry and Gordon, about my grandparents, is because I've always known it was an incredibly important story, the way that they challenged government policy, very hostile government policy, so that they could be together was never a secret. The fact that my grandmother was the first Japanese war bride was not unknown in our family. In fact, it was quite well known that there was a big media campaign and they were very famous at the time in the 50s. And that continued on. So as there were significant anniversaries of the war, there'd be, they were the feel-good story of the war, if you like, the successful love story to come out of World War II. And I was always really interested in telling stories, and I always had a sense that this was the story that I was going to tell. This one was the big one for me. And I remember at 11 years old reading another book about my grandparents, which was, we would probably call it narrative nonfiction these days, which was written in the 60s. And I read it and closed the book and went, that's not my grandparents. I can do a way better job. And so then spent basically 20 years honing my writing craft and getting comfortable with ways to tell big stories, because I knew it was a big story and an important story, and I knew I only had one shot, so I didn't want to stuff it up. So it took me a long time to get there, but in 2018, that's when I started to properly research it and get into it, and here we are a few years later with a book on bookshelves, which is pretty special. I decided to approach it with a fictional lens because I am not a documentarian or a memoirist or a biographer, and I'm much more comfortable in a fiction space. My background is in screenwriting. I've worked on a lot of different drama TV shows in Australia, and so that's what I know, and that's really what I'm comfortable with. And I wanted to be able to tell the story in a way that allowed me to explore the world as well, the bigger picture of what was happening at the time. And I also knew that there were parts of the story that I was never going to be able to gain access to. My grandfather passed away in 2010, and so I never really got a chance to speak to him directly about his experiences, but I had access to interviews that he'd done in newspapers or on radio, and so they became a really great source of information for me from his perspective. And I spoke to my grandmother and had her stories, but the book is set over a period of about 6 or 7 years, and so there's a big amount of time just to rely on memory. And I knew that there would be things that I couldn't fact check and I couldn't authenticate. And so really, when I was building it out, I decided that the best way to approach it would be to fictionalize it and allow me to tell the best possible version of this story, to give it the best shot on bookshelves. The things that I found most challenging about writing about real people but telling a fictional version of events, it was really shifting it from being my grandparents in my head to being Gordon and Cherry or Don and Nabucco. And it was interesting because that separation did come, and now I see them as very distinct separate characters and separate individuals. But it was a really interesting process to do that, but also to delve into the other people in my grandfather's family, some of whom I didn't know at all, who passed away before I was born. And I tended to favour the aunts and uncles that I knew better, and including them as kind of main characters or main supporting characters in the story. And it was really interesting to then also look at the story on a wider level and find the subtext of what my grandparents had never told any of us, what they weren't saying, but what history was telling me through other sources was absolutely true. And, you know, it's interesting when you speak to people and they say an off-the-cuff remark and it sends you down an entire rabbit hole to you know, which gives you a whole chapter, which gives you, you know, a massive chunk of your story, and it's a completely unintentional. They think it's totally unimportant, but it's this, you know, little golden nugget that becomes a huge part of your story. I've had a few people ask me about whether I got permission from the family and how they all felt. And I I don't think I ever expressly asked permission, but everyone knew that it was always something that I wanted to do. I'd been talking about it for a really long time, and I'd been trying to take stories where I could and listen to stories from people, even though, you know, when I was young, you don't know how to ask the questions to get the answers that you need. That's a real skill that you learn as you get older, particularly when you're interrogating an idea or a character or a moment. And so, you know, I had sort of clumsy versions of stories that I could then interrogate more as I got older. So I never actually went around and kind of asked permission, say, but it was given regardless. There was never any pushback from my family. They were always incredibly supportive. And I think their concern was that there were a lot of other journalists who knew about the story. And so there was other interest from other people. And I think that they were much more comfortable with the idea of one of us telling our story as opposed to a journalist telling our story again in another way. My family actually did not read the book until I had the final author copies in my hands. Um, my first readers actually I was doing a writing course at the time. So my first readers of the very early first draft were part of that writing course. And then really it was my agent and then my publisher who were the next kind of first readers. And it wasn't until we were kind of halfway through the editing process that I kind of went, I actually need someone to properly read this. But the the difference with that is I actually wrote the novel as a screenplay first. So I had first readers of the novel, but then I also had first readers of the screenplay who read an earlier version. So they were friends who I work with in screen, who I trust implicitly, some of whom knew the story, some of whom didn't. And, you know, even though it was the screenplay version and the screenplay is very different now to what the novel is, they still had an incredible effect on the novel, and how their notes got folded into the novel is still very much on the page. The difference between novels and screenplays is actually kind of incredible to think about, and I didn't really appreciate how different they were. I had written a lot of prose as a kid, and I was very familiar with prose, and then when I found screenwriting, I pivoted into that because it's a lot shorter and it's a lot easier to get to the end. And I didn't realize how much a screenplay is a transition document. It's a blueprint. It's it's there for the actors to learn their lines. It's there for the production designers to build a set and decorate it. It's there for the editors to understand. And so there's a rhythm and a flow and a language in screenwriting, absolutely. But it's completely different to the way that you approach a novel, because a novel is so internal for characters. And that's something that I think I'm still, and I'm going to refine for a very long time in my craft, is getting into my characters' heads, getting into as kind of a deeper point of view. Because in screen, you don't have to do that so much because you're relying on an actor's face to convey emotion and the way that an actor moves across the room. And so you can be a lot more kind of, I guess, expositional, at least in your kind of action and description of something, as to how the actor moves through the space, whereas you can't, it's a different kind of blend. I see screenplays as being very external and novels being very internal. I did a lot of research and I did get to Japan. It was actually the first time that I'd ever been. And I went in 2019 and had been planning to go back and to do a deeper dive in 2020, which didn't happen for obvious reasons. But I did go to Japan and I did go to Hiroshima. I really wanted to get to where my grandmother was from, and that was a pretty intense visit for me. I wasn't expecting it to be quite as confronting as it was for me. And yeah, I remember the first day that I was there, I thought, I arrived late. I arrived in the afternoon. I was like, oh, I'll just walk around the city. That's fine. I'll go down to the Peace Park and just walk through the Peace Park at sunset. It'll be really nice. And I got to the river and I just went, oh, absolutely not. I can't do this today. I'm not mentally prepared. Why did I think I could do this just on the fly? So I went and got some okonomiyaki, instead some Japanese pancakes for dinner, and then had a big sleep and made sure that I was much more mentally prepared the next day to go back and go through the Peace Museum and all of that kind of thing, because, that it's such an incredible way that the Japanese preserve their history, and I really wanted to respect that and respect the stories that they were telling. And I think the way that they tell their history absolutely had an impact on how I told out my little piece of it as well. It's interesting because I often say that this book has magic in it and this story has magic in it, and I see it so often, this kind of cosmic interweaving of stories and people and things like that. And so to have Oppenheimer come out basically a week before the book is released is kind of mind-blowing. That was obviously never planned. And so to have a discussion on a big scale about the bomb in Hiroshima and it's been interesting to see the reaction to Nolan's movie. And I've actually had quite a few people say your book is kind of the antidote to Oppenheimer, because it presents what Oppenheimer doesn't, which is the Japanese experience. And I mean, even to a point, the way that the Australians experienced it, because, a lot of the Australians did go to the ruins of Hiroshima as a kind of a day trip, an excursion from base, which is, a scene in the book where, and my grandfather did go and did see it. So yeah, it's an interesting reflection that the timing of that has happened in the way that it has. I couldn't have written this book, I think, even 6 or 7 years ago, because I didn't fully appreciate my own experience of race in Australia. And you can't tell a story about the White Australia policy without talking about race. And it was something that I didn't necessarily appreciate as much until I started to examine my own racial privilege and the discussions of race that are continuing to this day. And I think actually having those discussions about race, which is something that a lot of people are very uncomfortable, a lot of white people are very uncomfortable talking about, I think it just deepens and enhances the story itself, because Australia does have a problem with race. I don't think we can deny that. It's clear in even today, and I've had quite a few people who have read the book say, wow, it's actually kind of scary how much it feels like things haven't changed. And so to be able to package a political question, I suppose, in a book with a very beautiful cover as a kind of little Trojan horse, if you like, people pick it up expecting that it's going to be historical fiction, and I say that it's not your average historical fiction. I think there's a lot more to it than just a kind of fluffy romance. And it's not to denigrate historical fiction at all. I love historical fiction. But I think it's very easy to judge a book by its cover. And so to be able to prompt questions about the bigger picture of Australian society and where we sit in a racial viewpoint, I think is always really important. And I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation forever, until we really look at white privilege in Australia and how it does benefit more and affect those who don't have that white privilege. Ven and Harry did have a very strong reaction to the moment their son turned around and said that he wanted to bring home a Japanese girl as his wife. And I think part of it was to do with the attitudes at the time. It was very recent post-war time. There was obviously a lot of propaganda in the news about the Japanese, and there was a lot of horrible things that happened with the Japanese and the prisoners of war, and all of those kind of things that happen in war. And I think there's something where you are a product of your time until you can unpick those learnings. And I think maybe for Ven and Harry, or Ven particularly, those learnings weren't quite so stitched in. She is very well known to be very broad-minded. She didn't really care about what you looked like or where you were from. If you needed help, she would help you. And if she needed help, she'd bring you in to help her. And so I don't necessarily, I think the Japanese-ness was, for her anyway, less of a hurdle. It was more she was worried she was going to lose her son to another country. I think that was her problem, and the fact that she knew it was going to be incredibly difficult. She knew what the White Australia policy was. At that stage, it had been in place for 50 years. It was very entrenched. I mean, there's some amazing, they had board games and posters about the White Australia policy that they would sell at the time. So it certainly was a very strong part of Australian culture at the time. And I think part of her was just being realistic. And then my theory is that, without having spoken to her about this at all, is when they found out Cherry was pregnant, I think the grandchildren started to make a real difference and change the way that she thought about things. And Harry definitely did take a little bit longer to warm up. I think he was also very aware of his own reputation and the reputation of his family and protecting his own children. And then ultimately realized that Cherry was also one of his children, actually. And through, by marrying Gordon and having Gordon's children, she was part of the family, whether, they wanted her to be or not. And so it was just easier to join Gordon and support him rather than fight him, because I think he probably would have lost that battle anyway. I've not been reading very much lately because publication month has been incredibly busy. But I am looking forward to reading Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. I'm told that that's an incredibly weird and strange story, and I do love weird and strange. And what have I read recently that I really loved? I've been reading some really, all kinds of things, but again, speaking of weird things that I've loved, I really enjoyed Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, which is not historical fiction at all, and it is one of the most confusing books you will ever read, but I love all of it. And I really, really enjoyed reading that. But there's so many great things to be reading at the moment. So, I'm really spoiled for choice. So my next project that I'm working on at the moment is another historical fiction novel, also set in the post-war period in Australia. And again, kind of looking at more parts of the forgotten history between the Australians and the Japanese. So there's a little bit of Japanese pearl diving, there's a little bit of, kind of women doing wild things. So yes, it should be very fun. No worries, thank you.